Last year at the TAM conference, Phil Plait got a lot of applause for a talk about how to communicate atheism. And he began by taking a vote of people who used to be religious and were now atheists, and he got a great show of hands. And he then said, how many of you changed your mind as a result of being called an idiotic retard? Well, not surprisingly, he got the result that he wanted. Obviously, if somebody is a really deep-seated religious person, then if you call them an idiotic retard, you're unlikely to change their mind. However, my view, as I suppose somebody who never calls anybody, I hope, an idiotic retard, but does call their views idiotic, there's a big difference, as various people today have mentioned. I like to quote the English journalist Johan Hari, who said, I respect you too much to respect your idiotic beliefs. Now, my audience, the audience that I'm aiming at, are on the whole not dyed-in-the-wool faithheads, are not the sort of people who are never going to change their mind, and certainly not if you call them idiotic retards. My audience are people who are sitting on the fence. And I think there are enormous numbers of such people, very often because they haven't really ever met the counter-arguments. I warmed to the description of the Texas people for whom the very idea of disbelieving in God would be rather equivalent to disbelieving in the president or something like that. If you're dealing with people who've never even met the idea that it's possible to disbelieve in God, then those are people who might very well, I think, be influenced in a way that people who are deeply religious for reasons of scriptural conviction or something would be unlikely to change their minds. And so I don't mind calling, I wouldn't think I'd actually use the phrase idiotic retard, but something equivalent. I think that ridicule, as various people have said today, ridicule is a fine weapon. I'm not sure where it fits on the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King scale. I certainly don't want to advocate violence in any way, but ridicule seems to me a more subtle weapon. And ridicule, although it won't influence the people who are necessarily being ridiculed or their views are being ridiculed, it may very well influence people who are sitting on the fence or who didn't really realize that there was a fence to sit on. Tell them then that there is a fence to sit on. And I wanted to read a passage from the great Nobel Prize-winning biologist Peter Medawar, who's always been a great, I suppose, role model of mine. When I was a young man, an undergraduate, I read Father Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man, and I'm sorry to confess that I was very impressed by it, and it became briefly a convert to Teilhard de Chardin's kind of bullshit. And what won me round, what converted me, was reading Peter Medawar's review of The Phenomenon of Man, which I think is one of the greatest negative book reviews ever written. And the point I want to make is that I did not recoil from having this book that I had previously revered ridiculed. Quite the contrary. I saw it was the ridicule that changed my mind. And I want to read a bit to illustrate that you don't have to use violent. Has it gone off? You don't have to use violent language. You can use wit. You can use sarcasm, and you can use ridicule. The phenomenon of man cannot be read without a feeling of suffocation, of gasping and flailing around for sense. There is an argument in it, to be sure, a feeble argument, abominably expressed. And this I shall expound in due course. But consider first the style. because it is the style that creates the illusion of content, and which is a cause, as well as merely a symptom, of Teilhard's alarming apocalyptic seizures. The phenomenon of man stands square in the tradition of Naturphilosophie, a philosophical indoor pastime of German origin, which does not seem, even by accident, though there is a great deal of it, to have contributed anything of permanent value to the storehouse of human thought. French is not a language that lends itself naturally to the opaque and ponderous idiom of nature philosophy, and Teilhard has accordingly resorted to the use of that tipsy, euphoristic prose poetry, which is one of the more tiresome manifestations of the French spirit. Then there's a gap, and then he comes to the end. How have people come to be taken in by the phenomenon of man? And remember, I was one of them. I was taken. How have they come to be taken in by the phenomenon of man? We must not underestimate the size of the market for works of this kind, for philosophy fiction. Just as compulsory primary education created a market catered for by cheap dailies and weeklies, so the spread of secondary and latterly of tertiary education has created a large population of people, often with well-developed literary and scholarly tastes, who have been educated far beyond their capacity to undertake analytical thought. Now, that's ridicule, but that's ridicule using the rapier, using the scalpel, rather than using the club, the baseball bat.